In this video, we'll be replacing the driver's side axle in this 2007 Mazda CX-9. It's going to be the same process for the first generation from 2007 to 2015. All right, we're going to remove our front wheel. It's going to be a 21 millimeter. So what we need to do here is remove the staking from our axle nut. And basically that is this bent down portion right here. So we're going to use a small fine point chisel and just pop that up. And we only need to move it up close enough back to original so we can spin this nut off without doing any damage to the threads. Even though we are replacing this, we don't want to do any damage. All right, so that looks pretty good. That should spin off. So we'll grab a 36 millimeter, and we'll go ahead and back this nut off. Now that staking that we were trying to round out is right here. So again, you just want to open that up enough so that you can back off your nut. So the next thing we're going to do is find our cotter pin for our castle nut. We're going to remove the cotter pin. Now, side note, when you take out your cotter pins, you should never really reuse them. If you're in a bind and you don't have another one and this cotter pin is actually in decent shape, you can reuse it. Typically, they're a one-time use. So what I'm trying to do here is just straighten it out. Once you get it straight enough, go ahead and push it back through, or reach through the other side on the hook here and roll it out. And again, this is why, one of the reasons you wouldn't want to reuse them. And from here, we're going to take off our castle nut. We're not going to take it all the way off, but we are going to thread it most of the way to the top. It's going to be an 18 millimeter. So once we have a good gap set right here, what we're going to do is grab a medium hammer or a small sledge, and we're going to hit our knuckle. We're going to try and shock our tie rod to drop down. If that doesn't work, last thing you can try is coming in right here, flush with your castle nut and the top of your ball joint and your tie rod end, and hitting it straight down. All right? You don't want to mushroom out the top here. So that's your last option. We'll try hitting it right here. That's what we're looking for to happen. Once that happens, we can take our castle nut off, take our tie rod end right out. Now if you want to from here, you can put your castle nut back on. This will ensure you don't lose it. And we just let our tie rod end sit off to the side. So now we're going to remove our speed sensor. It's going to be held in by a 10 millimeter bolt and this shoulder or this flange on the bracket. First thing we're going to do is take out the bolt. So once you have your bolt removed, this one's actually pretty loose, but if it wasn't as loose as ours, what you can use is a small flat blade screwdriver and just evenly, front, side, or back, pry this up and out. All right, so ours actually wants to come right out. We'll just help it with this screwdriver and just pull it straight out. What may end up being stuck on yours and what you may end up needing to help out is this shoulder right here. All right, so ours came out nice and even and easy. We can take this, we're going to tuck it up around its own cable and out of the way. Now this is magnetic, so just be careful. It's not going to pick up shards or pieces. So now we're actually going to remove our bottom link that's attached to our lower control arm. It's going to be an 18mm nut on front, and in the back there's going to be a shoulder, which is just like a nut. We're going to back it up with an 18mm wrench. So now we can remove our wrench. What we're going to do here is just push or pull our bottom link straight out. Once you have it pulled out, we're just going to rotate it up and out of the way. So now we're going to loosen our ball joint. It's going to be a 14mm pinch bolt. It's going to go straight across, holding in your ball joint and your lower control arm. All right, so we have a 14mm socket on this side, 14mm wrench on this side. Now we've unlocked our steering on this, so the wheel wants to spin as we're trying to loosen up this nut or this bolt. So what we did, and you can do this if you're running into this issue as well, just quickly and loosely put your tie rod end back into your knuckle. That'll help your wheel from spinning a little bit while you're trying to get your bolt loose on your ball joint. Okay, so when you loosen up this pinch bolt, what may end up happening is that your nut comes free, but your bolt is still in through the ball joint, and in this case it actually just came right out. If it doesn't come right out, you can just push it through from the other side with either a Phillips screwdriver or a small punch. Now what we're going to need to do is with this small pry bar, separate our knuckle from our lower control arm. What you don't want to do here is ruin the boot on your ball joint down here on your control arm. So be very careful of that. What we're actually going to do is grab a large pry bar and push our entire control arm downwards. Okay, so what we're going to do is put a long pry bar between our cradle and lower control arm, and we're going to pry our lower control arm downwards, releasing our ball joint from our knuckle. When that happens, we're going to take our knuckle and pull it forward slightly. So the goal here is to get our ball joint out of the knuckle. Oh, there we go. And we can release our control arm. So now we have our knuckle free from our control arm and the rest of our suspension, which means that it's kind of free floating attached to your strut. You can tell it's at a forward angle, angled outwards on the bottom, which will allow us now to grab a hold of our axle, pull it out of the knuckle, out of the hub. We're going to keep some forward tension. We're going to grab our caliper, keep a little forward tension on the knuckle assembly and pull our axle straight back. I'm going to have to bend it, pull it out, and set it aside like that. So now under the vehicle, we can see the back half of our axle shaft. We're going to need to come in between the transmission body and the axle shaft with a long pry bar, or a pry bar, right between the two. And we're going to give it a couple of good taps with a rubber mallet to separate the axle shaft from the locking retaining ring inside. Now be aware, there may be some transmission fluid that comes out, so you want to have some kind of spill protection down or collection mat. And when you're ready, go ahead and give it a couple of taps. All right, looks like we're pretty good. We'll try now at this point to pull it out. And if we can't get any movement out of it, then we'll need to give it a couple more whacks. It is separated, so if anything, we'll just need to pry it out a little more, but let's see if this is enough to release it. Oh, it's still stuck in there. There is a little retaining ring, a locking ring in the inside that we're trying to separate it from. So it looks like we're still stuck on that ring. So we'll see if we can pry it out a little further. Now at this point, you don't need to hit it with a hammer. If you can get in here with an angled pry bar, we can just use a little leverage and pop it out. There we go. And now we can take it right out through the wheel well. So now we're going to take our new axle shaft and slide it into the opening that we had our old one come out. And before we go any further and try and mate the two ends here to the transmission and the shaft, we're going to take our new lock ring, which should be on your new axle shaft, and you'll see that there is a piece of that ring missing. All right, so we're going to angle or set that missing piece downwards. That's going to help us use gravity to let that ring sit that way and stay that way. Once we have that set, we're going to slowly work the shaft into the opening. Once you have your axle shaft seated into your transmission, we can start to work on getting the outside into your hub. First thing we're going to do is turn our knuckle out of the way. We're going to take a little bit of grease, put it on the splines of our new axle. No need to go crazy with a lot of grease, just a nice light coat across the splines. And what I'll also do is just put a little dab of grease the same way inside our hub. And then we're ready to install our new axle into our knuckle. So we have it bent. We're going to keep it bent at this angle. What we're not going to do is pull. That will separate the joint at the back side of your axle. So we're going to make sure during this process we're not pulling our axle apart. What we're going to do is take our knuckle and hub. We're going to bring it out a little bit and angle it. And we're going to take our new axle and guide it into the hub. We're going to make sure that our speed sensor is out of the way so we can't damage it. So now you can see if we try to put our axle into our hub, that our control arm is in the way. It is workable, it will be a little bit of a pain. So what we're going to do is use our pry bar. And we're going to lower our control arm again out of our way. We're actually going to put our pry bar underneath where our tie rod end goes and keep it there out of our way. Now what we can do is take our axle and guide it into our knuckle and hub. Alright, once you have it guided into your knuckle and hub, we can release our control arm So now we're going to take our knuckle and hub assembly, pull it straight. So now that our hub and knuckle is facing straight out, what we're going to need to do is take our control arm, lower it down so we can get our ball joint back into the knuckle. So again, we're going to use our pry bar up into the cradle, and we're going to push down. All right, so we're going to make this ball joint back into here. Okay. Now we can release our pry bar. Straighten out our knuckle a little more. Now during this process, if you find that you cannot push your knuckle back to get the ball joint into the knuckle, what may be happening is that the splines on your axle aren't matching up to the hub splines. If that's the case, go ahead and spin your hub, and you should be able to align your splines and get your knuckle to push backwards. Okay, so we have our ball joint in. Now we can start to reassemble. All right, so now we're going to put our new axle nut on. What we're actually going to do is put our axle nut on and bottom it out really tight and then back it off. So we pull our axle all the way forward, and then we're going to loosen it up a little bit just to hold our axle in place. And you'll notice this axle nut isn't going to be staked into the axle like your old one. So go ahead and start it. This is going to be a 35 millimeter. All right, so all the way tightened up, we pulled our axle forward. We'll go ahead and back it off just a little bit. Okay, so now with our knuckle turned sideways, maybe a little bit too far, we might have to adjust it back slightly. We're going to put our tie rod end back into our knuckle. So we're going to align the hole with the tie rod end and push it into position. With upward pressure, we'll go ahead and thread on our castle nut. Now we're not going to torque these down, but I am going to tighten it down until it's nice and snug. It's nice and snug. All right, so now we're going to take our link, put it back into our control arm. I'm going to swing it all the way in and down and into our control arm. Now we may have bumped that link at some point. We may need to straighten it out or realign it to get into the control arm. So now we're going to install our speed sensor back in. So our speed sensor is magnetic. So while it was out, you want to make sure it's free and clear of any debris. And we can go ahead and insert it back into our knuckle. And then from there, we can put our bolt back in place. Start it by hand. And we'll come back and we'll tighten it down. Okay, so we're going to tighten it down, we're going to bottom it out. And then we're going to go another quarter turn. And that's good. So now we have our link into our control arm. We're going to go ahead and start our nut by hand. We're going to snug that nut up. We're going to also back up that lower link with an 18 millimeter wrench in the back. Now it's going to be an 18mm socket on front as well. We're just going to snug these up, and then we'll come back and torque everything down together with the vehicle suspension under load. Now we're going to do our ball joint pinch bolt. What you want to do is look straight through this hole and make sure that it's a clean hole all the way through, and you're not either too high or too low on your ball joint from your control arm. There's a groove in that ball joint that you want to put this bolt directly through. So we've taken a look through, we are clear. We'll go ahead and put our bolt in, and the nut on the other side. And again, we'll go ahead and tighten this down or snug this up. Okay, so now what we're going to do is put a pole jack underneath our control arm and raise our front suspension to mimic load on the vehicle. If you're working on the ground, this is where you want to put a floor jack underneath your control arm and raise up your suspension. So what you want to try and avoid is actually putting anything in the center of your ball joint here. So we're moving just a little further back off of our ball joint the best we can. And we're going to raise our front suspension here. Okay, so now that we have our front suspension raised, we can come back and we can torque our bolts down. So now we're going to torque down our link. It's going to be an 18mm socket in front and an 18mm wrench in back. We're going to torque this down to 45 foot-pounds. Now we're going to tighten down our ball joint pinch bolt. It's going to be a 14mm on both sides. And we're going to tighten this down to 45 foot-pounds. Okay, so now we're going to torque down our castle nut. It's going to be an 18mm. We're going to torque it down to 50 foot-pounds, but you'll also notice that a castle nut has cutouts in it. Those cutouts, you want at least one of them to match up with the hole in your tie rod end ball joint, because you're going to need to put your cotter pin through. Whatever you do, don't back it loose to get the holes to line up. You want to tighten until you get the holes to line up. So we're going to go to 50 foot-pounds, see where that leaves us. All right, so we're a little bit too far back. Okay, so now we have our hole in our ball joint that lines up with the castle nut, so we can go ahead and put our cotter pin through. Tap that all the way in and bend over the remaining portion of our cotter pin. Now what I like to do with my cotter pins here is bend them all the way over. Grab them, line them up straight, grab a little hammer and just tap them down flat, and then bend this back end down so it's not as sharp if you come in here to check or to work on it. There you go. So now that we're done torquing our suspension under load, we can go ahead and remove our pole jack. Now if you're working on the floor with a floor jack, if you need to, you can go ahead and remove your floor jack now. We're working on a 2-post lift, and for us to go to the next step, we're going to need to put the vehicle close to the ground. So we'll need to remove our pole jack. So now we're lowered down to the ground because we're going to use a pry bar between our studs or our lugs to stop our wheel from spinning or to stop our hub from spinning. Before we torque our axle nut down, we're actually going to take it back off, put a little bit of oil on the back side, and then we'll torque it down. So again, this is a 35 millimeter. All right, so we have our axle nut. Again, we're going to put just a little bit of oil right here, put it back on, torque it down. Put just a little bit of oil on that surface there. To speed up this process, we're going to use the impact. And now we'll come back and we're going to torque this nut down to 202 foot-pounds. So this axle nut that we put on here came with our new axle. You'll notice that there's no way here for you to stake into the new axle. What we're talking about is here is an example of a different axle nut that you would stake a portion of this lip into the axle. All right, so the axle would have a cutout. This axle does not have a cutout anywhere, and this nut cannot be staked into this axle. So once you have this torqued down, that's it. Now we can go ahead and put our wheel back on. Typically when I put a wheel back on, I will do 2 lug nuts top and bottom, and I'll rock it back and forth to try and get it as flat as I can. Sometimes they're a little difficult to get nice and flush. This helps. And then we'll put our other lug nuts back on. We're going to snug them up while we're in the air, and then we'll lower the vehicle to torque them down. So now we're down on the ground, the wheel can't rotate. we're going to torque down our lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds, and we're going to do it in a crisscross pattern. After finishing this installation, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.